You recently researched the history of development in the Pearl River Delta. That's the region of southern China with Guangzhou, Hong Kong, Shenzhen, Macau, tons of these huge cities.
Right.
But a lot of them developed relatively recently, or at least Shenzhen. What did you learn? What was most surprising about your research when you looked at the history of development in this region?
Well, we looked at really two key aspects of the Pearl River Delta. One is the urban growth, and then also the environmental impacts of that urban growth. And yeah, it was very educational. Really only one, as far as we know, one comprehensive study has ever really been done on the Pearl River Delta, and that was at Harvard about 10 years ago by a group of students. So it's an area that deserves, I think, more study. And what we found is that we believe it's the largest urbanized region in the world in terms of population. It has about 80 million people in it. So I think probably the most interesting thing for me was simply learning more about this area that I live in, but oftentimes don't really know enough about.
When it came to the environmental impacts, what did you find there?
Well, I think that's the story of the Delta that is less successful than the urbanization side, because we did find that there's been serious environmental degradation over the last 30 years during this process of urbanization. They've lost about 500 square kilometers of wetlands in the Delta region. And many of their streams now, in fact, 35% of their streams have been classified by the Chinese government as least, as the most dirty, the least clean of all the classifications. So there's real, I think, problems related to this urbanization that we're seeing on the environmental side.
Is water quality the biggest problem then?
Water quality, certainly, just straight pollution of the water. But the interesting thing about it is the Pearl River Delta has always been an important food source for the region. Guangdong province is known for its seafood. So we're seeing a loss of seafood habitat. We're seeing a diminishment of fishery resources. So it does have knock-on effects in terms of quality of life in the Delta.
As the region continues to develop, I mean, there's 80 million people now, but it seems to continue to grow, and signs point to it growing even more.
Right.
What are the most important things to consider from a planning perspective to limit some of these environmental hazards?
Well, we think there's really 3 or 4 key strategies that the governments of the jurisdictions in the Pearl River Delta can take on. And one of those is what we call densification of the cities. So it means transforming some of the lower density industrial zones to a higher density mixed use development. That can be done on a city by city basis. The other very important thing is for the cities to continue to invest in transit infrastructure. So subway systems, trains, high-speed rail, to link all of these cities together. Because when you stretch it out, if you straightened out the Delta, which is now in sort of a horseshoe configuration, it would be almost as long as the Washington-New York metropolitan corridor in the United States. So we're talking about a very long distance, so it's important that the transport systems help support the urban growth.
So this conference, we're talking about megacities,
Right.
And this is a perfect example of one, Shenzhen, the Pearl River Delta. Are there specific concerns for megacities from this environmental perspective? Are there specific opportunities maybe? You mentioned transit for these cities that sort of grow into each other's urban areas and become a big megacity. What's a new typology for an environmentally sensitive megacity? Is that even possible?
I think it is. I mean, the one trend I think we're seeing that's more positive is because many people now are moving to cities, especially in China, you're having a very large rural migration into the urban areas because that's where the opportunities are. That allows us to, I think more strategically about the environmental components of these megacities because we are seeing densification, And that lets, as cities densify, that gives us the leverage to address, I think, some of these environmental issues as equally aggressively as we're addressing, say, subways and transport systems. So I actually think it's a good opportunity. I think megacities have the ability and the power to not only address their urban issues, but also their environmental issues.
How's the Pearl River Delta expected to cope with climate change, or how is it already being affected by climate change?
That's a great question. The Delta obviously is affected by sea level rise, and we did a project, SOM did a project up in Guangzhou called Bayaton, where we looked at the potential impacts of sea level rise in the Delta, and it's fairly substantial. So what we recommended is that they begin to take measures now to set aside buffers to estuaries, buffers to the water systems, pull development back, concentrate development where it makes sense to build, and then begin connecting those places with transit systems. So again, I think strategically it's possible to mitigate against sea level rise and climate change. But yeah, it's a substantial issue in coastal areas everywhere.
What's the role of the tall building in the Pearl River Delta today and going forward? Because 10 years ago, a lot of cities were building super talls, especially in China, to put themselves in the map. But I think this area is on the map pretty thoroughly. So, so where do we go from here?
Well, I think one thing I learned in this study was that Hong Kong, for instance, has more skyscrapers, which are classified as 100 meters tall or taller, than any other city in the world. So that was a new fact for myself. I also learned that, according to CTBUH, this Pearl River Delta will have 3 of the top 20 tallest towers in 2020. So just 4 years from now, 3 of the tallest buildings in the world will be located in Pearl River Delta. So I think the potential as part of this idea of densification is perfect for tall building construction. I think the Chinese are also learning quickly how to build tall buildings themselves. So I think it's a very bright future, actually, for tall buildings and people that like to build them.